New at 5, governing the behavior of elected officials.
The Omaha City Council is exploring 2 ordinances that would do just that. Brian Mastry is live to explain how this works and the reasons behind it.
Aaron, these are the 2 items that will be introduced tomorrow afternoon at the Omaha City Council meeting. Both are ordinances, one to be voted on by the people in November if moved forward by the council. But both could really be called the Vinnie Palermo rules. When Omaha City Councilman Vinnie Palermo was criminally indicted by the feds in April of 2023 and then kept in jail until trial, his colleagues worried about his constituents. Who would represent the voters of South Omaha while Palermo waited behind bars for justice on the public corruption charges? It took a half a year to fill the seat.
When we looked at the charter, we realized, there really wasn't a lot that we could do. There weren't the teeth that we think we needed in order to remove him from council in a more timely manner. District 4 essentially went without representation for the better part of 6 months.
The Omaha City Council Law Committee, made up of Brinker Harding, Amy Melton, and Danny Begley, forged ahead with a plan that wouldn't tie the hands of the city if a similar situation to Palermo's presented itself. This would allow an empty chair to be filled sooner. Instead of having to wait for 3 months of missed meetings, the remaining council members could take action if 4 consecutive meetings are missed without an excused absence.
We as elected officials, I think, are expected and should be held to a higher standard. And that's, as we're conducting the city's business, we should be honest, we should be ethical, we should treat people with respect, and that's both outside agencies and city personnel. And currently that's not, we don't have that.
The code of conduct piece of this would give 5 council members the power to sanction another member accused of bad behavior, something cities like San Antonio, Texas, Denver, Colorado, La Vista, Nebraska have, but Omaha does not. Under the proposal, a council member could also be removed from office if they moved out of the district they were elected to represent, or if they violated one of those code of conduct rules. First reading is tomorrow, public hearings a week from tomorrow. On your side, Brian Mastry, 6 News.
Now, at tomorrow's City Council meeting, we'll also see Mayor Stothart's proposed budget for next year. It will give us a clear look at what city agencies will be dealing with in 2025. The public will get a chance to weigh in at a public hearing on August 13th.